Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Reason and Theology. So, in 1 hour, I'm going to be delivering my lecture on Can Catholic Doctrine Change? Exploring the possibility of doctrinal reversals. And this is a topic that's very dear to me. It's the topic of my doctoral dissertation. And so it's something that I've thought about for several years now, very intensely. And I want to maybe just kind of introduce the topic to viewers and have that conversation about the question of what the Magisterium itself says about doctrinal reversals. Like I said, the lecture starts in 1 hour. If you want to go ahead and sign up, you can still do so. You definitely have time now if you're watching live. If you just simply go to rtcourses.com, you can see, if you just scroll down, Can Catholic Doctrine Change? And you can sign up there. And you still get a chance to take the advantage of the 40% off the Magisterial Studies bundle as well. So take advantage of that. So yeah, if you want to attend live, or if you can't attend live, and for the Q&A and all that as well, once you reserve your spot, you'll always have access to the lecture. So it will be posted later on tonight if you can't attend live. So don't let that stop you. For those of y'all who have signed up, really looking forward to this, really excited to see you in just an hour on that. In order to just kind of introduce the question, I wanted to just talk to all of you today about the question of doctrinal reversals, just from the perspective of Pope Benedict XVI. Obviously, he was previously known, prior to being Pope Benedict XVI, as Cardinal Ratzinger. And prior to that, he was Father Ratzinger, right? A really well-known theologian who was an advisor at the Second Vatican Council. I say that because we're actually going to read something from him from that time period. Then we're going to take a look at something from him from his period as Cardinal, and finally from his time as Pope. Because he does weigh in on the question, can the Magisterium err? If it can err, it could obviously reverse some of its doctrines. Now, it's a very nuanced conversation when it comes to doctrinal errors or reversals, what is potentially fallible versus what is infallible. There are some things that just cannot be reversed. There are some things that are infallibly taught, and there are some things that are taught with a less character than infallibility, and therefore in theory could be reversed. And that's not my opinion. That's what the Magisterium itself teaches, right? And this is hardly controversial for anybody who studies the area, right? But it is something that a lot of people just don't know about. So let me maybe introduce that topic to you all by just looking at a few things that Ratzinger himself said. So this is from his work, Theological Highlights of Vatican II. He wrote this in his younger years, and he tended to be a little bit more liberal back then. He kind of got a little bit more conservative over the years. And so we'll look at some comments of his from his conservative period as well. I'm going to show you everything on the whole, but he was an advisor at Vatican II, an advisor to his bishop, and advised him in matters of theology. He was just a young priest at the time. But he certainly knew his theology. And he writes a, commentary on Vatican II due to his participation in it. And here's what he says about the document from Vatican II on religious liberty. He says, the document, it also says that it leaves intact the traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of men and communities toward the true religion and the only Church of Christ. He says the term duty here has doubtful application to communities in their relation to the Church. Later on in the declaration, the text itself corrects and modifies these earlier statements, offering something new, something that is quite different from what is found, for example, in the statements of Pope Pius XI and Pius XII. It would have been better to omit these compromising formulas or to reformulate them in line with the later text. Thus, the introduction changes nothing in the text's content Therefore, we need not regard it as anything more than a minor flaw. He's very candid here in saying, look, there's part of the document in the introduction that says, hey, we're not changing anything. But later on in the document, he says it goes to change a lot of doctrinal things. So it would have been better to just take that part out or reformulate it, because at this point it's just contradicting itself and there's an error in the text. That's what he's saying, at the time. But what I'm trying to highlight here is the part where he says that the document corrects certain things from Pius the 11th and Pius the 12th. And this is not isolated, right? I mean, there's a lot more that could be said about that, other popes that are in question. And in this conversation on religious liberty, is there a reversal here? Is there a change? A lot of theologians argue, yes, Vatican II changed some of the doctrines of some of these previous popes, not infallible doctrines, but non-infallible doctrines that were eligible to be changed. And so you could see Father Thomas Guarino or Father Francis Sullivan and others arguing that, right? So there's others who attempt to harmonize them and say there's a way to, understand this all without there being an actual full-on reversal, right? So there's still kind of a debate on the question. But for young Ratzinger, he felt that there was just simply a contradiction and a correction, and therefore he's pretty candid there about the church erring in its magisterium in some of those previous instances, the papal magisterium, and the Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council, correcting those errors. That was his position at the time. Did that change when he became a little bit more conservative in his later years? No, it did not. It did not. Because people will often point out, well, hey, look, that was when he was younger. He was kind of more liberal back then. He was wearing like suits with ties instead of a clerical collar. So, maybe he just changed his position. Maybe, in theory, but in reality, from later texts of his, we know that it doesn't appear that he changed his position on the question of Vatican II correcting some things from the papal magisterium prior to that, or on the question of reversals. He doubles and in fact triples down on it, as I'll show you here in just a moment. And this is part of what we're discussing in the lecture coming up later on. So again, if you want to sign up for this and learn more about it, rtcourses.com, just click on Can Catholic Doctrine Change and go ahead and sign up, because it will be 45 minutes from now, and there will be a period for Q&A afterwards as well. Okay, so let's take a look at something from Ratzinger when he's cardinal. By this time, he's the head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. Fernandez's position now. So he was kind of the right-hand man of John Paul II, the doctrinal arm of the church, the head of the Inquisition. The DDF is the same office as the Roman Inquisition. Just goes by a different name now. It certainly has a different objective, it would seem. Hunting heretics, it doesn't appear to be on its high priority list. Okay, so Ratzinger, when he's the head of the dicastery, they release a document. He and John Paul II released a document, Donum Veritatis, which I talk about all the time, right? Every other show, probably. Incredibly important document for conversations about the magisterium. Well, he gives kind of some commentary on it as it's being released, as the dicastery tends to do today. When a document comes out, Fernandez will go and answer questions in front of a group of reporters and stuff. So that's kind of what he's doing here. And in talking about this, let me share my screen and show it to you. This is from his commentary on the release of the document. It's called Cardinal Ratzinger, Theology is Not Private Idea of a Theologian. It was published in L'Osservatore Romano in 1990. Okay. So there's a lot to it. Well, worth your time as far as reading the whole thing, but let's maybe skip down just for time purposes to the relevant portion. Okay. The document does talk about various levels of teachings, and it is relatively clear on the question of there being non-infallible teachings that obviously could potentially be reversed. So in that context, He says the text also offers different forms of binding, which arise from different levels of magisterial teaching. It states, perhaps for the first time with such clarity, that there are magisterial decisions which cannot be and are not intended to be the last word on the matters as such. So you can see he's kind of being discreet, but he is at the same time letting you know there are some magisterial decisions, and here he's talking about teachings in the context of teachings, that are not infallible in nature, but they are a substantial anchorage in the problem and are the first and foremost an expression of pastoral prudence, a sort of provisional disposition. So pastoral prudence, the application of some principle to some particular situation. He's saying, look, these are not infallible in nature. He says their core remains valid, like there's some truth to the core of some of these decisions, but the individual details influenced by the circumstances at the time may need further rectification. It's a very nice way to say they could have got some of the details mistaken or didn't fully take things into account. The document does talk about that, and could correct its decision later on. It's a very gentle way of saying the church can make a mistake in some of its magisterial teachings at the non-infallible level. He's not talking about at the infallible level. Obviously, he's going to say for infallible teachings, you can't have a mistake. By definition, infallible means without error. He's talking about those non-infallible teachings of the church. He's saying, there might be some core truth to them, but they could still be off in some of their details. In this regard, one can refer to the statements of the popes during the last century on religious freedom. There you go. So did he change his position from Theological Highlights of Vatican II? It doesn't appear so. No, it doesn't appear so. He thinks that the decisions of Vatican II on religious freedom, the teachings there in Dignitatis Humanae, they correct some of the teachings of previous popes on the matter, Leo XIII, Gregory XVI, and so on. Okay, that was his position. You might not agree with it. Okay, that's fine. Feel free to disagree with Cardinal Ratzinger. I'm just telling you what his position is. Did he change that as Pope? Sneak peek? No. He still maintained this as Pope, as I'll show you in a moment. Okay, so religious freedom, he says, is an example, as well as the anti-modernistic decisions at the beginning of this century. He's talking about the Pontifical Biblical Commission and their anti-modernist decisions on biblical questions and biblical studies. So, for example, some of those early decisions said that you have to maintain that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. You can't say that he didn't. He says those are errors. Those are mistakes that were later on corrected by the Magisterium itself. Later on, the Magisterium says, actually, you can hold to the view that Moses did not author the first 5 books of the Bible. And so those initial decisions saying you can't hold to that, there was some correction needed there, is what he says. And so he's given that as an example, for instance. He says, especially with regards to the decisions of the Biblical Commission at the time, it was very much against like the higher critical studies and of secular scholarship at the time, at the turn of the 20th century. Later on, the church became much more open to that form of biblical study. As a warning cry, and by the way, if you don't believe me, just look at the New St. Jerome commentary on the Bible. It's very clear. It's very open to it now. As a warning cry against hasty and superficial adaptations, they remain fully justified. So he's saying there was some justification for it at the time. A person of the stature of Johann Baptist Metz has said, for example, that the anti-modernist decisions of the church rendered a great service in keeping her from sinking into the liberal bourgeois at the time. So even though they weren't correct, it helped keep the church from like going into really extreme forms of liberalism is the idea. But the details of the determination of their contents were later superseded. Okay, that's a fancy word to say reversed, corrected. once they had carried out their pastoral duty at a particular moment. Okay, so he's pretty candid here as Cardinal about the potential for reversals in some of the teachings of the church, especially in reference to these like prudential judgments, the application of certain principles to specific situations, and so on. And he wants to say there might be some core truth to the teaching, but the particular application of it, yeah, that could be corrected. Okay, well, as Pope Benedict XVI, he delivers this famous 2005 Christmas address to the Cardinals, Roman Curia, on December 22nd, 2005. Well worth reading the whole thing. This is where you get the idea of the hermeneutic of continuity from. And so we've seen it many times. I've spoken about it numerous times, both in my lectures and on this channel. Okay, so notice this part, though, right? This is pretty fascinating. Guarino actually mentions this in his work on continuity and reversals in Vatican II. He says the Second Vatican Council, this is Pope Benedict speaking, the Second Vatican Council, with its new definition of the relationship between the faith of the Church and certain essential elements of modern thought, has reviewed or even corrected certain historical decisions. But in this apparent discontinuity, it has actually preserved and deepened her innermost nature and true identity. So he's talking about both discontinuity and continuity, reversal and restoration, correction and restoration. What's he talking about? In context, he's talking about the religious liberty issue, dignitatis humanae. That's the context, the decree on religious freedom here. He's talking about those decisions on religious liberty. There were some elements that were corrected from certain historical decisions. Like what? Well, he told us in Theological Highlights of Vatican II. Some of these decisions of the popes, some of the teachings of the popes in the preconciliar period. He sees Vatican II as correcting some of those. In other words, the popes made an error. They made a mistake. Well-intentioned. There was still some truth, some core truth to their judgment, but in the particulars, in some instances, they got it wrong, and Vatican II corrected that. But by Vatican II correcting it, he argues Vatican II is actually restoring the most innermost nature and true identity of the church and preserving and deepening it by actually being more in continuity with its core teachings. So he wants to say, yeah, some of these popes made a mistake. Vatican II corrected that. But by Vatican II doing that, it's actually being more consistent with its overall understanding of the faith. And Vatican II's decisions is more in line with it than some of those decisions of the popes previously. So it's a relatively veiled, but yet clear, I think sufficiently clear way of him saying the Magisterium can err in some of its non-definitive acts and non-definitive teachings and judgments, prudential decisions, and those can be corrected by later magisterial interventions. And he believes Vatican II is an instance of that. And he believed that not only as a theologian at Vatican II, but also as Cardinal, as the head of the CDF at the time, and also as Pope. You see him teaching that in his Christmas address to the Cardinals, the very one where he's talking about the hermeneutic of continuity. Okay? All right, so that's what we're going to be talking about in the lecture. So go ahead and sign up now. We will be starting that in 40 minutes. Go to rtcourses.com, Can Catholic Doctrine Change? Exploring the possibility of doctrinal reversals, and we will be talking about it in more detail there, what can and cannot change according to the Magisterium. Looking forward to seeing all of you there. All right, take care. God bless.